So last time we looked a bit more at just sort of Roman civilization. We looked at the status of women in Greek and Roman civilization, and in general, bad. Jewish culture, too, is also not very good. We looked at education, a bit about that, just how the household worked and how most families were sort of a family business. And then we spent a lot of time looking at the whole patron-client relationship, which not only was the underpinning of Greco-Roman civilization and just how that society worked, it's also really the main picture the New Testament uses of our relationship with God. So any questions on that before we move on? I know there were a lot of questions last week. So, all right, so moving on then, we're next going to take a look at religion in the Roman Empire. Of course, the dominant religion in the Roman Empire outside of Judea and Galilee was Greco-Roman paganism, which was polytheistic. They worshiped many gods, Jupiter, Apollo, Mercury, all the planet names. And the gods were anthropomorphic, meaning they were like people. They were essentially made in the image of man. And these gods personified the forces of nature. In fact, there's an excellent book entitled The Bible Among the Myths, which I would highly, highly recommend, that talks about the difference between ancient mythology and biblical accounts. And one of the things it gets into is about the nature of pagan gods and how they really were the personifications of the forces of nature and how they were seen as being one with the physical world. And so this would have been the most common religion in the empire. It's just the worship of these many, many different gods. And both the Greeks and the Romans were very prolific builders of temples and shrines to the gods. You might remember from Paul's speech to the Athenians at Mars Hill about the unknown God, where he opens by talking about how religious everyone was and how many, many temples and statues of gods that he saw, even one to the unknown God, just so they could cover all their bases. And, this wasn't that unusual. Many Greek and Roman cities were sort of built around a particular patron deity. For instance, Ephesus had Artemis. They had the great temple of Artemis. And, Athens, of course, is built around Athena, the goddess of wisdom. But, you find worship of almost all these gods everywhere. The historian Ivor Davidson writes, "The Roman Empire was a world full of gods. Images of gods and goddesses were found in gardens and in shop windows, and there were shrines and statues at crossroads and along the roadsides. Temples of all shapes and sizes were a standard element of public architecture." So everywhere you went, there were statues of gods. If you looked at a wealthy Roman house, they were filled with mosaics and frescoes depicting gods, usually in sexual situations. And they believed that these gods actually dwelt in these temples and in these shrines. So along with the worship of these gods and this paganism, there was also a lot of just superstition. Your average Roman was very, very highly superstitious. They really lived their lives according to omens and signs and those kind of superstitious activities. Basically, to the Romans and the Greeks, the supernatural pervaded the world. Again, the gods were these personifications of nature, so really the gods were a part of the world around you. And so everything you did, everywhere you went, you were always under the influence and under the watch of all these different gods and spirits. And these natural forces, which were seen as spirits, and the Greek word for spirit is daimon, which we get the word demon from. These were seen as they could be either good or evil. And a lot of times they weren't necessarily good or evil. They were simply forces or beings that you had to appease. You had to do the right rituals and make the right sacrifices to get them on your side. And again, superstition was a very common part of daily culture. The Romans especially were highly, highly superstitious. Seers, or priests who would tell the future and read omens, would determine the will of God by doing things like observing the flight patterns of birds. They would cut animals open and look at their entrails and use those to foretell the will of the gods. Or they would even observe things like the feeding patterns of chickens. And all of these different things that they would observe in nature would be taken as omens to indicate the will of the gods. And of course, if you cross the will of the gods, then their wrath would come down on you. Until the time of Constantine and sort of the rise of Christianity as being much more dominant, astrology was a very respectable pastime. So virtually all decisions were made with the help of astrologers who would, consult the stars and tell you what the proper lucky dates were. What dates, to start your business or start on a voyage or anything like that. What the best time would be according to the stars, where the gods would bless you. The Romans wouldn't go on any military campaign or start any sort of official act without first discerning the will of the gods through, again, some kind of divination. And most homes contained a small shrine to the household gods. Every, household had its own gods, which were called the lares, Lares. And these were these protective spirits of the household. Usually they were seen as the spirits of dead ancestors, but each home would have a shrine to these household spirits. And visitors to the house would be expected to, offer some incense and maybe pour out some wine to give as an offering to these household spirits so that they would bless the home. And if you were wealthy enough, you could even commission small statues or paintings to be made of your household gods to set in these shrines. So another historian writes, it was a numinous world, numinous here meaning filled with spirits. It was a numinous world with supernatural forces all around, and one dared not show a lack of proper reverence for fear of retribution. Again, it wasn't that you loved the gods, you were afraid of the gods. Thus, the ability to exercise some control over these forces was a major goal of one's personal religious devotion. In other words, you sacrificed and you offered incense and these things in order to gain some sort of control over your surroundings, in order to make the gods do what you wanted them to do. And this was the essence of magic. This is when the Bible talks about witchcraft, this is what it was. So he says, for this reason, the magical arts, astrology, divination, and magic were extremely popular. So when the Bible talks about witchcraft and magic, this is the sort of things that it meant, that there were these rituals designed to control the gods. And by controlling the gods, you could control your circumstances and make life work out well for you. So, people read magic and they think like, Harry Potter or something, and that's not what it was. God forbids magic, not only because it's consorting with demons, because, there was, Hebrew, quote, Hebrew magic that was about God. But magic was always an attempt to control God. And so God forbids magic because he wants to make sure his people know that he cannot be controlled. That they are to obey him, not seek to control him. Because pretty much every other pagan religion was all about controlling the gods through magic and through ritual. Mm-hmm.
Is that why, part of the reason why the Bible they say fear the Lord your God is because it's like fear him?
Yes, very much so. I mean, there is so much of the Old Testament, if you understand how pagan religion worked, makes so much more sense. A lot of the things that God commands and says, because so much of the Old Testament was him sort of having to beat into the Jews' heads over and over and over again. Do not attempt to control me the way the pagans attempt to control their gods. Do not try to manipulate me through worship the way that pagans manipulate their gods through worship. And, because in the end, he wants to emphasize that he is God, he is in control, and that we serve him, not the other way around. So this was the basics of Roman paganism. Again, very polytheistic, and it's very what we call syncretistic. And syncretism, which is still very much around today, is basically the idea that all religions can sort of be dumped and lumped together, and that everyone is sort of free to make up their own religion by picking and choosing from a whole host of different options. And that's very much how Roman religion worked in the time of the early church and in the time of Jesus. Because there are all these different gods to choose from. And there was nothing that was particularly unique or exclusive about any of them. First of all, Roman religion in general wasn't really Roman. It was a blend of older Greek, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Persian religions. The Romans just everybody they conquered, they sort of took their religion and kind of incorporated it into their own. So Roman religion was sort of a hodgepodge of all of these different influences. So you had all of these different gods, all of these different rituals, all of these potential ways of appeasing, the natural forces. And usually, if you were traveling to another part of the empire, and you were just like a trader or a soldier or a merchant, anyone like that, you would pay your respects to the local deity. And it was fine. At home, you may worship Mercury, or you may worship Aphrodite or something like that. But if you go to, say, Mesopotamia, you're going to offer an offering to Marduk, and you're not going to think anything of it. He's, the god of there. You have your god, but you're perfectly okay with, giving a sacrifice to this other god, because in your mind, they're all real. And it's, who you worship is just kind of your choice. And so very syncretistic, very pluralistic. No one religion or god was worshipped exclusively. And the Romans really didn't care who you worshipped. They didn't care that the Jews wanted to worship Yahweh. Now, it was a bigger deal that the Jews wanted to worship only Yahweh. Again, Ivor Daverson says in his book, The Birth of the Church, openness and tolerance were the norm, and most people in the Roman world could not understand why the practitioners of any religion should have felt the need to claim, as the Jews did, that their God was exclusive of all others. The idea of worshiping one God exclusively was utterly foreign to them. It literally just did not compute in their heads. It made no sense. This was one of the reasons that to the Romans, the Jews were very silly. Now, we talked about at the beginning of the course that the Jews did get some exception. They were given some extra allowances because Julius Caesar liked them, because they flattered him, and Alexander the Great liked them. So they had some extra leeway. They were allowed to worship Yahweh and Yahweh alone. Something the later Christians, once they began to be more separate from the Jews, weren't allowed to do. But for the most part, it wasn't a big deal to one Roman if you worshipped, a different god than him. Because he might worship that same god in different circumstances. Civil religion was also a very big part of Roman society because Roman culture was sacralistic. And basically, that's a word that means there was no separation of church and state. Civil religion, that being religion as part of the government, was a very important part of the society. And in fact, to the Romans, this sort of government religion, this civil religion that everybody kind of went along with, was very, very important because they saw it as necessary for social harmony and stability. Because there was nothing more important to the Romans than that everybody just get along and not cause trouble, because that made governing the empire and taxing the empire much easier. So their goal was always harmony, social quiet. They did not want any kind of unrest. Therefore, everyone participating in this sort of government-sponsored, religion was very important to them. Again, Roman cities were filled with temples. Most public events, sporting events, like chariot races, gladiatorial games, were all dedicated to different gods. And to the Romans, the gods were very political because they saw Rome as being very favored of the gods, and they believed that the gods favored Rome and that they would continue to favor Rome so long as they were properly worshipped. So, and from their point of view, as long as the gods were being properly worshipped, Rome would flourish and would be protected from our enemies. Of course, that meant the Christians were a great threat to this. The Romans saw the Christians as a great threat to stability and public safety because they were threatening to, disrupt the worship of all these gods that the Romans saw as protecting them. And, because there was no separation of church and state, there was a committee of priests known as pontiffs, which you might recognize as a Catholic term nowadays, which was an adjunct to government. Basically, there was a governmental department for priests. Now, the pontiffs weren't professional clergy. They were aristocrats who were basically functioned as priests for 1 year at a time. And again, this was a political position that people would seek out for the power and the prestige and the money that it offered. So they would serve for a year at a time. They would be appointed, by government officials for this. They presided over public sacrifices, and they were seen as guardians of sacred traditions. Though, among the aristocracy, there was a lot of skepticism toward traditional Roman religion. Have you ever seen the old Stanley Kubrick version of Spartacus? Classic film. But there's a part where I think it's Julius Caesar is talking to someone else, and it's, they're talking about religion, and he says, oh, in public I believe, talking about the gods. In the public I worship all of them. In private I believe in none of them. And that was a lot of the aristocratic Roman attitude. Not always. There were certainly Roman aristocrats who were very devout, but there was also a lot of skepticism. But again, to them, religion was about social harmony and unity, so they served as priests as a political position. So all the citizens and subjects of the empire were expected to honor the gods of the state. So you could worship your own gods, but you were expected to honor the gods of the state, including the Roman emperor. Now, it's a common belief that Roman emperors believed themselves to be gods. Most did not. But most did believe that they would become gods upon death. Many of the Roman empires were declared to be gods after they died. If you declared you were a god while you were alive, you were seen as insane. That's what people like Caligula and Commodus did. But you were, would probably assume that if you were a decent emperor, that you would be proclaimed a god after your death. So everyone was expected to observe the various public holidays and participate in the processionals and the ceremonies that honored these gods. So again, you weren't expected to worship them in your private life, but you were expected to go along with the public observances. And, then starting with Caesar Augustus, emperor worship does become an integral part of Roman religion. And Augustus, his name alone, his actual name was Octavian. The name Augustus was given to him by the Senate, and it literally means divine, august one. And so he was being seen as, being godlike even during his life. And again, once, emperors died, they would usually be deified. And that wasn't that unusual. If you know much about classical mythology, you know that a lot of humans were elevated to the status of gods after their death. A lot of the classic Greek heroes like Hercules and, people like that, Perseus, they were seen as becoming gods after they died. and the emperor was a lot of times seen the same way. But again, it was only the kind of crazy ones like Caligula, Nero, Domitian, who demanded to be worshipped while they were still alive. Now, it didn't matter if they were crazy. If the emperor was demanding to be worshipped as a god, you still did it because they would kill you if you didn't. But most of the people would have still seen them as being nuts, but they still would have gone along with it. But there was no question whatsoever about worshiping a dead emperor. Questions so far? Now, another aspect of pagan religion that I think is one of the hardest things for Christians to wrap their head around, because to us, morality is an essential part of religion. That is almost how we think of religion, is a source of morality. We are moral because God is holy and we wish to be holy as God is holy. But paganism, Greco-Roman paganism, was inherently amoral. There was no moral code attached to the worship of most of these gods. There may have been a few exceptions. For the most part, the worship of these pagan deities was all about ritual. It wasn't about personal behavior. There was no moral code. And that's because the gods themselves weren't moral. Watch like Clash of the Titans or something. The Greco-Roman gods were capricious. They were deceptive. They were very sexually immoral. They had no sense of justice or righteousness to them. They had a lot of sense of vengeance. They would get angry at people for doing something that maybe the person didn't even know that offended them and go after that person. But it wasn't seen as justice or righteousness. It was just seen as vengeance.
But you're speaking of these gods, but they're all just made up. They're
all made up.
Them into.
Yeah, but to at least probably your average Roman, they would have been seen as real. But since to them the gods were amoral, there was no moral component to their worship. But yeah, they were made up, unless you're one of the people who believe that they were real, but they were demons. Because there are a lot of the early Christians. You read the writings of like the early church fathers, people like Justin and the like, and they will claim that the Roman gods are actually demons. I would go with the more they're fake, because the Bible seems to much more take the attitude of they're simply not real. But a lot of early Christians believe that the Roman gods are actually demons. But again, for sort of standard paganism, there was no concept of sin or salvation. Sacrifices weren't to cover your sin. They were just to placate the gods. They were something that the gods demanded. And if you did something to offend the gods, again, if you did something to offend the gods, it wasn't necessarily because it was morally wrong. It was just they didn't like what you did for some reason. So you had to offer a sacrifice or they would smite you. So sacrifices were to placate the gods or to try to induce the gods to grant you favor, to try to get things out of them. But there was no real sense of atoning for sin. The closest the Romans would have seen as the idea of sin would have been something like cowardice in battle or something like that. They believed in what are called like the martial virtues, military virtues. So if you were a coward in battle or something like that, you were disgraced. That was the closest you could get to a real idea of sin in their culture and religion. So mainstream religion was completely devoid of any kind of commandments. There were no real doctrines. There was no list of things you had to believe. There were myths, but there wasn't like, these are things you must believe to, say, be a follower of Apollo. And there was no real kind of ultimate authority. There was also no standard orthodox understanding of an afterlife. Some Romans might believe in an afterlife, the Elysian fields. The Greeks had a concept of the underworld or Hades. But everyone might have a different idea of what those were, or even if they existed at all. There was no demand in the religion to believe in an afterlife. So the focus was very much on pleasing the gods in this life, because that would, if you could please the gods, that would give you as good a life as you could get. And if you did believe in an afterlife, you probably saw it as a uniformly unpleasant place, no matter how good of a person you were in when you were alive. Hades was pretty much the same for everybody. There was no sense of heaven or hell or of any kind of real eternal reward.
Weren't there the Egyptians? They would bury people with their wives.
Yeah. So the Egyptian religion is a bit different. Because in Egyptian religion, you were supposed to sort of be weighed against your deeds. And if you were seen as good enough, you would be sent to the good afterlife. And there was a sense of a bad afterlife. That was Egyptian religion. But mainstream Greco-Roman religion really didn't have that. So, one his writer described it as an a la carte religion. You picked and choose. There was no, as he said it, there was no fixed menu when it came to religion. And of course, tied into this very strongly is the whole idea of fate. Because to first century Romans, your life was ruled by fate. And you really didn't control it. In fact, this idea is not even restricted to the Romans. This was common to pretty much any pre-Christian society. The Greeks had the idea of the fates. The Norsemen, the Vikings, they had the Norns who were also controlled the fates of men. So most ancient peoples did not see themselves as being in control of their own lives. They didn't see their actions leading to consequences. To them, everything that happened was just the arbitrary fate ascribed to them. And even the gods were controlled by fate. The fate was higher even than the gods themselves. And a lot of the more philosophically minded Romans, and we'll talk about philosophy in a bit. We might not get to that till next time. But philosophy was also a really big part of the Greco-Roman world. But a lot of the more philosophically minded Romans tended to sort of absorb the gods into this all-consuming idea of fate. Instead of seeing the gods as persons, they would just see the gods as sort of a manifestation of the overriding power of fate. And fate was very personified. Fate was, fate with a capital F. Your fate as a power that controlled the entire universe. There was actually a goddess of fate, the goddess Fortuna. But again, that was just sort of a convenient way to visualize, to personalize fate. But fate was really seen as an impersonal thing. And in fact, Fortuna was often depicted as being deaf and blind. Where do we get that image nowadays? Justice. Justice is blindfolded with the scales. Yeah. And that's where that visual is taken, is at least in part taken from this idea of Fortuna. Fortune being deaf and blind. It didn't matter what you did. It didn't matter what you said. Your fate didn't know. Your fate didn't care. So fate was seen as unpredictable, capricious, volatile, and amoral. So fate was fickle. It was the fickle finger of fate. The flying fickle finger of fate.
I'll say that 5 times.
But to a lot, again, of the more philosophically minded Romans, and there are philosophical schools that were really big on this. The gods were really just different aspects of this one overriding, controlling, impersonal force of the universe that was fate. And you had no control over your fate. You had no say in it. What would be, would be. Questions? So, of course, in pretty much any pagan society, religion was also very closely tied to social class. During the empire, basically, in most cases, your social class and your geographical location determined your religion. The upper classes, as I've mentioned, tended to ignore traditional religion outside of the civil religion in favor of philosophies like Stoicism, Epicureanism, or even just straight up agnosticism. And again, I think next time we'll talk about a lot of those philosophies. The lower classes were more standard believers in the traditional religion, but a lot of lower class people also embraced what were called mystery cults. And these were cults that usually came more from non-Greco-Roman cultures in the empire. You had things like the Osiris cult, which originated in Egypt. You had Mythrism, which came out of Persia, which wasn't even in the Roman Empire. You had the Great Mother cult, and a lot of these mystery cults. And those are very popular among a lot of the lower classes. And the mystery cults really started to pop up in the 2nd century BC. Now, a lot of them were derived from older religions, like there was a cult of Osiris and a cult of Isis, which were from ancient Egyptian religion. Because Egypt was seen as this very exotic place. And just like people nowadays tend to look at, Asian cultures or Native American cultures as being these ancient cultures full of wisdom, to the Romans, that's how they viewed Egypt. And so the same way that, your kind of hipster nowadays might be into like Native American religion or Eastern religion, a lot of Romans were into Egyptian religion. Because it was strange and it was different and it was cool. So a lot of these sort of fringe groups evolved into these kind of exotic mystery cults. And these really proliferated throughout the Roman world. And a lot of times they would start in some location where there was supposedly some supernatural event that would give rise to a cult. For example, the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus was supposedly built at the place where a rock fell from heaven. And this was seen as a sign from the gods. So these mystery cults tended to follow a very general pattern. So for one thing, they're referred to as mystery cults because they were supposed to be a mystery to anyone who was not initiated into the cult. So you couldn't just go and ask someone about their doctrine, about what they believed. It was secret. It was a mystery to anyone outside the group. Usually there would be some kind of central myth that would extend to explain the mysteries of life, death, salvation, and immortality. Again, a big one was the myth of Isis and Osiris. Egyptian mythology isn't as well known, but basically Osiris was killed by his brother and chopped up into pieces and thrown into the Nile. And his sister Isis got those pieces out and reassembled him and brought him back to life so that Isis and Osiris now rule the underworld. And this was sort of the central myth of the cult of Isis. And, it was seen as a way of explaining, life, death, rebirth, salvation, and immortality. And so you usually had these central myths that were the kind of the foundation of these cults. And there would be some form of initiation rite, which sometimes would include things like baptism. Or sometimes the baptism was in water, sometimes it was in blood, the blood of an animal. And you would go through these initiation rites to become part of the cult, and only after you were part of the cult would you be taught it secret.
Which religion was that?
There are a lot of them. The best one for like the baptism in blood came out of Mythrism, which was started as a Persian. Mithras started out as a Persian god, and basically you would stand in a pit. Underneath, like in a bowl, would be like on a platform above you, and the throat of the bowl would be slit, and his blood would come down, and it would flow over you. And that is how you would be initiated into the cult of Mithras. which was a very masculine cult. Women were not allowed to be part of Mythrism. A lot of these cults were very geared toward men or women. That was another thing, is that, cult like the cult of Kabil, the Earth Mother, or Isis, was a very female-oriented cult. And that was a way for women to have some kind of religious power. Because in your standard Greco-Roman religion, even if you worshipped a goddess, the men were still at the head. The men were still in control. But there were more feminine-oriented mystery cults. So usually you'd be initiated in, then you'd be given some kind of esoteric knowledge or password or something to learn, and these secrets would grant you eternal salvation. And a lot of times also there would be these, very ritualized fellowship meals. And so these cults started to develop in the 2nd century BC, which would be the 100s BC. By the time of the early church, by the 1st century, they were pretty popular. They weren't even approaching the number of people who just followed the standard Roman religion, but they were becoming more common.
Would the Seder be considered one of those rituals?
And that's something I was going to address a bit, but it used to be, this has been sort of discarded now, but there was a period for a while where non-Christian scholars would accuse Christianity of basically being an upstart mystery cult. Not Judaism, because it way predates the mystery cults. But they would say things like, we baptize people, and we're concerned with eternal salvation, and we have a ritual meal. And so they would try to equate Christianity to the mystery cults and say that Christianity was just one more mystery cult. My Roman history professor in college claimed that. But that's kind of more fallen by the wayside, because the differences between Christianity and the mystery cults far outweigh the similarities. But it was a pretty common accusation. So one of the first mystery cults was the Orphic or Dionysian cult. It started in Greece. Dionysus was one of the Greek gods. He was the Greek god of wine and basically partying. There's a rather well-known ancient Greek play called the Maenads, which is all about Bacchus. And, wild parties and violent wild parties, and where people would get drunk and kill and things like that. And that was, the basis of the Dionysus cult. And it was based around the myth of the death and resurrection of Dionysus, or Bacchus. It was very orgiastic. Again, wild parties, orgies, drunk, sex, all that sort of stuff would be how you worshipped the god. Again, Dionysus was the Greek god of wine and animals. And so in order to attain union with their god, devotees would throw these drunken ritual parties called bacchanalia, after the Roman name Bacchus. And you'll still find nowadays wild parties being referred to as bacchanals. And that's where this comes from, that name. And again, the idea was to get thoroughly drunk, like off your head drunk, and that would allow you to directly experience the god. You would attain some sort of mystical union with the god and feel his power. Another bacchanalian sacrament was called the Feast of Raw Flesh, in which, after sort of whipping themselves into a frenzy, the people would actually tear apart a young goat and eat it raw. So, again, these are the kind of things that this was looked down upon in polite society. I mean, your standard sort of straight-laced Roman would have, not had a high opinion of someone in the Dionysus cult. But obviously, it was popular for obvious reasons. sex and alcohol. I mean, come on. And this cult actually stayed popular in some places until the late 4th century AD. So the mystery cults lasted for a while. A much more high-class mystery cult was the cult of Demeter, who was the Earth Mother. And even a few of the emperors belonged to the cult of Demeter. And this goes back to the Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone. The myth basically says that the god Hades kidnapped Persephone as his wife and took her to the underworld with him. And her mother was so distraught that she chased after her and tried to get her back. And it's all tied into the rhythm of the seasons. Demeter was a fertility and harvest goddess. And so this cult would celebrate the cycle of the seasons. And again, you go through various initiations to get to ever sort of higher and higher mysteries. You'd be taught more the further in you got. And this one was also associated with the baptism. People who wanted to enter the cult were baptized in the sea and sprinkled with the blood of a pig. And there were others. Won't go through all of them. A big one, though, and one it's important for Christians to be aware of, because this is something that still gets brought up a lot, is Mythrism, which I've mentioned, started as a Persian Zoroastrian cult who celebrated Mithra. And Mithra was seen as this semi-divine figure who is the mediator between man and the god Ahura Mazda. That was the Zoroastrian god. And now he's one that gets a lot of attention nowadays because he's one of the people. The Mithrist cult is where a lot of sort of your internet atheist types will try to claim that Christians stole a lot of their ideas from. They'll try to claim that Mithras was born on the December 25th, for example, and that he was born of a virgin, and that he had 12 disciples. None of this is true. But it's become popular among the internet YouTube atheist types to claim this and then say that Christianity was really just a ripoff of Mythrism. Though interestingly, if you actually look into it, a lot of the Mithraic rituals that seem to really mirror Christianity do not appear to have popped up until after Christianity started, which if anything indicates that the Mithras was borrowing from us. But Mythrism was a male-only cult, very popular. It was really a military cult. It was very popular among Roman military officers. And again, their best-known ritual was this bloodbath, where you be bathed in the blood of a bull that I already talked about. And it would appear that they believed that this blood baptism would grant you eternal salvation, either for 20 years or for all eternity. Like, maybe it was something you had to keep doing, or maybe it was like a one-and-done thing. We don't know. But that sort of, the bull was the symbol of Mithras, and that, being bathed in the blood of the bull came to be very symbolic of the whole religion. So Mythrism was a major competitor to Christianity in the early days of the church. It was one of the biggest mystery cults. It was one of the most well-respected mystery cults. And it was one of the biggest competitors to early Christianity. But again, it was male only. It had a very dim view of women, which made it very different from Christianity. So those are just some of the mystery cults that were going around. And again, there were loads of others, and you have them pop up and last for a while and then disappear. But these really, in a lot of ways, more than the official Roman religion, really competed with early Christianity for followers. They didn't have the power to persecute Christians, really, but they were some of the religions out there competing for followers, and would try to lure Christians away. And again, you'll still nowadays hear Christianity accused of being just another mystery religion. Again, there are some surface similarities. Mystery cults would claim things like divine revelation. They would try to foster a sense of community. They did believe in the idea of atonement for sin. They believed in some kind of mystical union with the divine, and they believed in some kind of salvation leading to an afterlife. So you do have some surface similarities. You would also have things like prophets speaking in tongues, not literally other languages, which is what I think the tongues in the Bible were, but just babbling noises like what you hear in like charismatic churches. That you saw that a lot in the mystery cults. And you would have, things like healings and exorcisms performed. You'd have like traveling charismatic preachers who would perform healings and exorcisms as a way of luring people into the cult. So there were some superficial similarities, but again, Christianity wasn't exclusive. It wasn't a mystery. And it very much had its roots in Judaism, not in pagan religion. So the superficial similarities are far outweighed by the very fundamental differences. And a lot of the superficial similarities are things you would kind of expect from almost any religion that was not mainstream. But, I hear some. And since these were mystery cults, there's still a lot we don't know about them. So it may be that their similarities to Christianity have been wildly exaggerated. Because, again, there's just a lot we don't know. But unlike Christianity, these cults were tolerated by the Roman state so long as they didn't cause any sort of social disruption. Because you could follow a mystery cult and still burn incense to the emperor. That wouldn't have bothered them. So these cults would not have seen themselves as exclusive in the way that Christianity did. So they didn't bother the Romans so much unless they caused trouble. So the Roman Empire really had a serious plethora of religious belief. I mean, all different stripes. You had religions brought in from all corners of the empire and places beyond, which isn't to say that, they were all equally respected. And a lot of Romans would have seen these other religions as being very suspect because they weren't Roman. They were barbarian religions. How dare they come in and taint our noble Romanness? But they were tolerated. And again, as long as you burnt your incense to the emperor and obeyed the emperor and declared Caesar as Lord, the Roman Empire didn't really care what you believed. In fact, there were even, Greek and Roman thinkers who kind of tossed polytheism aside and believed in some kind of single ultimate reality or God. Though usually they would have thought of that God as more kind of an impersonal force. You get that from people like Plato and Aristotle. They believed in some kind of single God, but it wasn't a personal God. And that belief would have been common with the more intellectually minded Romans. Questions? Well, that ends sort of Roman religion. The next thing up is philosophy. And in a lot of ways, Greek and Roman philosophy was more important to the early church than Roman religion, because religion was just about what people did. Philosophy governed what people believed. And all the ancient philosophies were the great competitors to the ideas of early Christianity. And early Christianity actually would sometimes express its ideas in philosophical terms taken from these philosophies in order to make them understandable to the Greeks and Romans. In fact, the very word that's used in John 1:1, the logos, the word, That is a philosophical term taken from Greek philosophy. Not that the idea of Jesus as the Word is taken from Greek philosophy, but John used that word in order to make his meaning more clear to the Greeks and the Romans, who would have understood that kind of concept. And so, understanding, a little bit about ancient Greek philosophy not only can help you understand some of the things that are spoken of in the New Testament, it also helps you see what the early church was fighting against, what, they were trying to rescue people from. When the Bible talks about vain philosophies and do not be deceived by empty philosophies and the like, it's this sort of thing that they're talking about. But rather than get into all of that now, I think this is probably a good ending point. So, any questions?
I got a question. That doesn't necessarily have to do with Roman religion, but in our Sunday school class, we were in Genesis about the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
And you touched on astrology. Do you think astrology began with Nimrod?
I doubt it began with him. Pretty much any scholar will tell you nowadays that when it says the Tower of Babel had its top in the heavens, it doesn't mean that it was really tall. It meant that there was probably some sort of astrological observatory or diagrams or something on the top. That the Tower of Babel was probably a ziggurat, a Mesopotamian pyramid, with some kind of astrological facility at the top of it. And so, but that would have almost been certainly done, would already been part of the culture. So it's highly unlikely that it was invented by them. Simply that it was, intended to be kind of the ultimate monument to it.
And I've heard that there's some belief that there's actually the Gospels inside astrology because they use a lot of the same symbols.
No, I would be astrology and any sort of divination is so strongly warned against in Scripture. I would be very wary of any sort of attempt to equate the two.
So they were saying that they thought it was Satan perverting the gospel.
No, because I don't see that in Scripture. It's there's a belief some people have that if there's a satanic something, that there must be a holy something as well the satanic is pulling from. But I don't see that in any sort of divination or any kind of sorcery or witchcraft. We're just outright warned against all of it. There's no sense of there being anything godly hidden in it or perverted in it. We're just told it's evil outright. Anything else? All right. Well, that will be it for today.